Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today. We're going to dive into something that literally affects every single one of us, yet it's kind of rare that we ever actually see it. I like to call it the invisible contract. Think about it. Every time you step into a clinic, a hospital, or even just open a telehealth app, there's this massive underlying framework of clinical ethics protecting you. It's the very thing that turns a doctor from just a scientist into a trusted healer. Today, we're unpacking the rules that govern your rights, your bodily autonomy, and your care.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the roots of medical ethics, check out the 4 core principles, unpack informed consent, navigate some tricky edge cases, and finish up with safeguarding and future challenges. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, the roots of medical ethics. To really understand how modern medicine works, we've got to look back at the incredible historical weight of the profession.
Take a look at this ancient vow. Above all, I must not play at God. That's from the Hippocratic Oath, and honestly, it anchors everything we're exploring today. It's not just some dusty piece of history. It's the earliest expression of medical ethics in the Western world. It's a powerful reminder to the doctor that having the power to heal, or sometimes the power to harm, is this awesome responsibility. It requires real humility and a deep, deep respect for the patient's dignity.
The journey from that ancient oath to where we are now is pretty wild. For the longest time, medicine was super paternalistic. Basically, doctors made decisions for you without really explaining the details. But then, a massive shift happened. In 1914, the Schlundorf case hit the courts, asserting that every adult of sound mind has the absolute right to determine what happens to their own body. Then, fast forward to 1976. After some horrific human experiments came to light, the Belmont Report was created to strictly define modern bioethics. We basically flipped the script from the doctor knows best to putting the patient right at the center. Now, this is a super interesting distinction. Morals versus ethics. We tend to throw these words around like they mean the exact same thing, but in a clinic, totally different. Morals are basically what society collectively feels is right or wrong. Ethics, on the other hand, is this rigorous, deliberate process. It's the actual explicit argument doctors use to justify why a specific clinical action is right. When a medical team faces a tough call, they don't just rely on a gut feeling. They use clinical ethics to systematically find the most justifiable option.
So, how exactly do they make those tough calls? That brings us to Section 2, the 4 core principles. This is essentially the operating system for modern healthcare.
Back in 1979, ethicists Tom Beecham and James Childress laid out what we call principalism. It's built on these 4 interlocking pillars: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And here's the key. No single principle automatically trumps the others. It's a constant balancing act. Let's break these down so you know exactly what your provider is weighing every time they treat you.
First up, autonomy. Literally, your right to self-determination. This means you get to make your own health choices without anyone twisting your arm, pressuring you, or manipulating you. It's exactly why a doctor can strongly advise you to take a specific medication, but there is no way they can force you to actually swallow the pill. Your values always take a front seat.
Second, we have beneficence. It sounds fancy, but it's basically the affirmative duty to do good. And we're not just talking about fixing a physiological issue or hitting a biological target. True beneficence means respecting your specific wishes, aligning with your personal values, and actively trying to improve your overall quality of life. The doctor has to aim for the best possible outcome for you as an individual.
Third is non-maleficence, which you've probably heard summarized as do no harm. But here's the catch. Medicine is messy. A lot of treatments, like surgery or chemotherapy, inherently cause some level of harm or carry huge risks. So doctors are constantly doing this delicate cost-benefit analysis. They have to be absolutely certain that the expected benefits of an intervention maximally outweigh its risks.
And finally, justice. The crucial point here is that even if a treatment is totally safe and exactly what the patient wants, it still has to be equitable. Justice requires the health system to fairly distribute scarce medical resources, ensure equal access for everyone, and fiercely protect against any form of discrimination. It's about looking at the big picture and keeping the whole system fair.
All right, Section 3, unpacking informed consent. Let's look at how all these high-level pillars actually play out in everyday reality.
The British Medical Association hits the nail on the head with this one. Consent is so much more than just hastily scribbling your name on a clipboard in a waiting room. It's a dynamic communication process. It's about empowering you with enough solid information so that you can confidently delegate responsibility to your doctor. It's the literal mechanism that protects your physical and psychological integrity.
For your consent to actually mean something legally and ethically, it has to check these 4 boxes. First, the patient needs to have the capacity to actually understand the decision. Second, the doctor has to provide sufficient info, the risks, benefits, and the alternatives. Third, it has to be 100% voluntary. And fourth, the patient must be completely aware that they can refuse the treatment or change their mind at any single point.
But as we know, real-world medicine isn't always so straightforward. That brings us to Section 4, Navigating Edge Cases, the tricky gray areas where standard rules don't perfectly apply.
This is where things get really tense. Imagine a patient who has a severe cognitive impairment, or someone in the middle of a massive emergency, or even tougher, someone who flat out refuses to let a doctor even assess if they have the capacity to make a choice. How does that invisible contract hold up then?
The official guidance here is, as you'd expect, incredibly cautious. If someone straight up refuses an assessment, doctors are trained to immediately look for red flags. Is there coercion happening? Is a family member applying undue influence? If they just cannot assess the patient, they have to carefully document it and make a call based on the best available info, keeping the patient's immediate safety as the #1 priority.
If it turns out you really do lack capacity, a specific hierarchy steps in. You might have a welfare attorney, a legally appointed proxy who has to act according to your known values. If not, they consult the nearest relative. But honestly, the most powerful tool you have is an advanced statement. It's a pre-recorded statement of your wishes made while you were fully capable. It can be legally binding, which means your autonomy actually survives even when you can't speak for yourself.
Treating minors? That is an absolute ethical tightrope. Kids and teenagers are constantly developing their own sense of autonomy, right? But the medical profession and society as a whole has a profound duty to protect them from harm. So doctors have to rely heavily on the benefit principle, acting strictly in the young person's overall best interest, balancing what the kid wants with the protective oversight of parents. Okay, let's move into our final section, Section 5, Safeguarding and Future Challenges. Because this invisible contract isn't static, it has to adapt incredibly fast.
Think about confidentiality. We all know it's a massive deal, a core right. But actually, the invisible contract allows for some very specific, totally justified breaches to your privacy. If a doctor suspects a vulnerable adult is being abused, or they encounter risks of female genital mutilation, or even threats related to radicalization, they are legally and ethically bound by safeguarding protocols to report it. Sometimes, protecting highly vulnerable people just has to supersede individual privacy.
And looking to the future, AI is moving into healthcare at warp speed, from reading scans to predicting outcomes. To handle this, the World Health Organization laid out some strict AI ethics guidelines. They demand meaningful human oversight, rigorous privacy protections, and most importantly, they state that any medical decision made by AI has to be intrinsically reversible by a human doctor. The whole point is to make sure machines assist human empathy, not replace it.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question. As algorithms get exponentially smarter and take on more of the clinical heavy lifting, how do we guarantee that your values, your right to autonomy, and this whole invisible contract remain intact? It really is the next great frontier in medical ethics. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Remember to keep asking questions about your care and stay curious.